Hello and welcome to this revision video for love and relationships poetry. If you're watching this video, make sure that you're doing AQA GCSE in English Literature. If you're doing a different course, then this video will not be suitable for you, because in this particular video we're going to be looking really closely at how to write a successful exam answer for this particular section of this particular course. So as I say, check your exam board, make sure you're doing AQA and the Love and Relationships cluster. Let's start by looking at the exam question itself, and I've got an example of one on the screen here. So it says, compare how poets present romantic relationships in When We Two Parted and in one other poem from Love and Relationships. And it says you've got 30 marks, and then it gives you a copy of the poem by Lord Byron. So in terms of the question itself, it's asking us to compare, so we need to look at two poems. In terms of the marks available, we have 30 marks, so we're looking for quite a substantial answer. The way I do it is to write an introduction and a conclusion and 3 quite chunky paragraphs about the two poems. Some people do that differently, and we'll pick that a little bit later. You get a copy of the named poem on the exam paper for this particular section, but then you've got to remember the second poem. So make sure when you're thinking about your revision, you're taking that into account. You need to know quotations and details about the poems off by heart. You do get a list of titles and poets' names on the exam paper just to prompt your memory as well, so make sure you use that and you connect the right title to the right poet, because sometimes people do not do that. So the first thing that we need to do is make sure that we understand the poem that's given to us. So let's read this poem first. When We Two Parted by Lord Byron. When we two parted in silence and tears, half broken hearted to sever for years, pale grew thy cheek and cold, colder thy kiss. Truly, thou art foretold sorrow to this. The dew of the morning sunk chill on my brow. It felt like the warning of what I feel now. Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy fame. I hear thy name spoken, and share in its shame. They name thee before me, and knell in mine ear. A shudder comes over me. Why wert thou so dear? They know not I knew thee, who knew thee too well. Long, long shall I rue thee, too deeply to tell. In secret we met, in silence I grieve, that thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. If I should meet thee after long years, how should I greet thee? With silence and tears. So in the exam, one thing I recommend to do is read the poem through carefully and then think about the 5 W's. So who's in the poem, where are they, when's this happening, what's happening, and why is this happening? So who's in this poem? Well, we have a speaker who is a lover who feels abandoned. We have the lover who has left the speaker, and we have some gossipers as well. Where are they? Well, the speaker seems to be in an isolated place. There's some hints of natural imagery, so we've got the dew of the morning, for example. He also remembers being at a social event. So at the start of the 3rd stanza, he says, they name thee before me and knell in mine ear. So there's other people there talking about his former lover. When is this happening? Well, the poem is from the Romantic period, which is the early 19th century. You may know a lot about the context of that. And the events in the poem take place after the lovers separate. What are they doing? What are they talking about? Well, the speaker is lamenting the end of an affair, the fact that he has to grieve for the relationship in silence. He has to do it in silence because if a woman has an affair at that time in history, she would be shamed, she might be ostracised or cut out from society. The speaker feels trapped in his distress. He says he's never going to forget his lover. And why is this happening? Well, Byron is reflecting on the lasting pain of lost or unrequited love. So let's unpick the question a little bit then. The first word, the command word, tells you to compare. So that's telling you to explore the similarities and differences with another linked poem. It doesn't need to be all the way through your essay, but there does need to be a few references connecting those two poems together. In terms of the theme of the poem, it says to write about romantic relationships. Make sure you pay attention to this in the exam. It might specify romantic or family love. It might specify unhappy love or happy love. So make sure your choice of second poem links with this. When you're doing your revision, make sure you revise poems with a range of different themes and topics so that you're ready to pick the appropriate second poem. You must write about the named poem, and you must choose a second poem from the anthology. The first thing I'm going to do is plan my response. It is so crucial that you spend a couple of minutes planning at the start of each question. Part of the reason for that is it will help you to give your answer more shape and more structure. And it will mean that you're not kind of remembering things later on in the essay that you should have written at the start and then putting loads of asterisks in and making it really messy. So planning is absolutely essential. Now, to answer this question, I'm going to write about when we two parted because that's the named poem. I can choose my second poem. It's got to be a poem that I remember, that I know really well, and that I've revised and studied. So I'm going to go for Winter Swans, and that's a poem that I really like. These poems work nicely together because they both have some nice natural imagery that really speaks to each other. So we can make some nice connections between the poems as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of get some ideas going. I'm going to be looking for 3 ideas for each poem. I might not get to write about all of those in the exam, I might not have time, but it's a good starting point for the plan. So I think the overwhelming idea in When We Two Parted is the distress that the speaker feels with his unrequited love, the fact that he looks longingly at this woman and she doesn't love him anymore. And that first couple of lines, which are repeated more or less at the end of the poem, articulate that quite clearly. I think the second thing I would pick up on is the lasting pain that the speaker goes through, and he uses imagery of death, quite violent imagery. So he says to sever for years. So to sever means to cut something. He says a knell in mine ear. The knell is a kind of bell that's rung at the funeral. And we also have that circular structure in the poem, which suggests that the speaker was trapped, kind of going over the same ground again and again, unable to move forward. And the final thing I'd like to talk about with this poem is a little bit different, and it's about the social expectations about romantic love. So he talks about how he's lonely, he's isolated, he can't speak to anyone about his love, and the reason for that is that it's been an affair. She should not have been having sex outside of marriage with someone else, and so he can't reveal that to anyone in society. So we have these social expectations. So he says, I hear thy name spoken and share in its shame. So people are gossiping about her, they're speaking her name, they're talking about her, and he thinks that that's shameful in some way because they're talking about the affairs that she has. Okay, my second poem is Winter Swans, so I'm going to jot down some ideas about this. Obviously, I don't have the poem in front of me, but I'm kind of working through it in my head. I'm going to do that chronologically, so starting at the beginning of the poem, working through to the end. We know at the start of the poem they've had a disagreement, and that's linked in with the natural imagery. So I'm going to put disagreement down as natural as weather. The clouds had given their all is that opening quotation. Later in the poem it's about hard work, how relationships take hard work, and the thought of separation can be painful. I'm not going to put the full quotation here, but we've got the image of the waterlogged earth, another beautiful natural image there. And then at the end of the poem, we have this idea of reconciliation. So how the couple decides they're going to work through this and stay together. And that is symbolised through the image of the swan's wings setting. Now the next thing I need to do is make connections between these ideas. So I'm going to aim to write 3 paragraphs in which I link the 2 poems together. Or you could do 6 individual paragraphs, it's up to you. I like putting the 2 poems together in the same paragraph, that's just a personal preference. So I need to make those connections, and I'm going to draw some lines to link the ideas together. So we have the distress of unrequited love. I think that links in with this idea about hard work, how relationships can be quite difficult and quite upsetting. And we have the lasting pain of separation. Now that's quite different, almost the opposite from this idea of reconciliation, I think. But when we're talking about comparison, we can look at opposites as well. We can look at differences. which leaves me with these ideas. Social expectations and disagreements are as natural as weather. They don't fit together perfectly. I'm going to link them together for now, but then when I come to write up my answer, I might want to tweak those ideas slightly. It's possible that given the time of the exam, I might not get to that anyway, so I'm going to kind of cross that bridge when I come to it and leave it till a little bit later. Time to write our introduction then, and as you know, I like my introductions to be comprised of 3 sentences. Here, because we're comparing 2 texts, it's a little bit different for the other videos that I've done, so I'm just going to talk you through this so that you know how to write a really top-notch introduction for the poetry. So sentence 1, we're looking at what the chosen poems have in common, linking it obviously to the theme of romantic relationships. Sentence 2, we're looking at the differences between the poems. And sentence 3, we're thinking, as we always do with our introductions, about what the writers are trying to teach us. So in terms of sentence 1, I'm going to say, in both When We Two Parted and Winter Swans, the poets portray the pain and suffering which individuals experience when romantic relationships break down. Then I'm going to move on to my differences. So, however, whilst in When We Two Parted, Byron communicates the lasting distress of hopeless love in a society with rigid expectations around male and female interaction. In the more modern poem, Winter Swans, Shears suggests that couples have more freedom to find a way forward when faced with challenges. Now, one thing that I've done there is not just linked the poems together and talked about the themes and the key concepts, but I'm also suggesting that I know about the historical context of these 2 poems as well. I'm not gone into detail about that because it's the introduction, but I have hinted at the examiner that I do know what I'm talking about in terms of the history. So you can see that here. The rigid expectations around male and female interaction, we know that that would have been the case at the time that Byron was writing in the early 19th century. And then here we're thinking about the more modern poem, you know, when couples are able to spend time together without a chaperone or without people suggesting that there's anything kind of nefarious going on. So we're looking at the context there as well as the themes of the poem. That's not necessary, but it's a nice touch to add in. Okay, final sentence. Overall, the poets communicate the, I'm going to change that, the crucial importance of love and secure relationships and the unhappiness individuals suffer when they are not able to sustain this. So I'm just going to take the yellow bits out. Obviously you wouldn't have those bits in the exam, but you could learn those questions off by heart so that when you get into the exam, you've got a bit of a hook to start writing your answer, and you don't have that fear of the blank page because you know what you're expected to write. Okay, next thing is to start writing our paragraphs. And on to our paragraphs then. There's lots of different ways that teachers use to help students to structure their paragraphs, lots of different acronyms and memory aids. I've got a few examples of these on the screen here. So what, how, why, what, where, how, why, point, evidence, explain, analyse, and there's lots more than that I've listed on the screen there. Ultimately, in my opinion, they are helpful aids for students to write, and if they help you, then that's absolutely great. But the main thing is that what we're doing in the main body of the essay is building up our evidence and exploring what that evidence tells us about the poet's ideas. So use whichever one of those your teacher has told you to use. Personally, I use point, evidence, explain, analyse just for ease. But as I say, use whichever one your teacher has told you to, because they all overlap slightly anyway. So what I'm going to do here in my paragraph is start by comparing the 2 poems. The question tells us to compare, and it's good to link them if we can. So both poems articulate the suffering faced by individuals when relationships become challenging. And then I'm going to focus in on one poem. So I'm going to focus in on When We Two Parted, and after that I'm going to look at Winter Swans. And Byron focuses on this by beginning his poem with an emphasis on separation. Okay, so I've got my main idea, looked at the two poems, zoomed in on Byron, and then I need to have some evidence, or I need to show where in the poem we find this emphasis on separation. And I'm going to do that by looking at the first couple of lines. So by starting the poem with the lines, When we two parted in silence and tears, Byron draws attention to the mutual unhappiness of both lovers as they seem to have been parted by forces beyond their control. It's an interesting word, parted, because it doesn't suggest that they have broken up. It suggests that somebody has separated them for some reason, and perhaps that's maybe the source of a lot of the speaker's unhappiness. I'm going to then use the word ostensibly. Now, ostensibly is a really good word to use because it helps us to look at the surface meaning of the text. And then later on, we can use the matching phrase on closer inspection as we peel back the layers of the text and really zoom in and get underneath the skin of the poem. So ostensibly, Byron's use of the pronoun we suggests that this separation was mutual and that both are in tears as a result of the events. Now, what you'll notice here is that I've used the word pronoun, which is naming a language device. I wouldn't get overly caught up in making sure that you've got every single language device and every single word type identified in your essay, but if you do know them, then it's good to use. So words that you might want to use in your essays are metaphor, symbolism, pronoun, direct address, rhetorical question, that kind of thing. But as I say, don't get too bogged down in it. So where have I got to? Yeah, so we're looking at the pronoun we. Then I'm going to add on to this the short lines and paired back language communicates the idea, the speaker's feeling that his life has been diminished. The word paired back language just means that something's kind of been restrained, it's been pulled in. So what we see in these opening two lines is that Byron isn't using the huge command of language that we know he has from his other poems. You know, it's really quite simplified, pared back. And then when I say his life has been diminished, the speaker feels that losing his lover has really reduced his quality of life. And then I'm going to add on here the fact that the poem starts with the definite word when, tells us that this relationship is definitely in the past. When I've been talking about the word pronoun, I said don't get hung up on not knowing all of the specific words for things. If you do know them, great. If you don't know them, you know, it's not the end of the world, and it's probably not worth wasting loads of time in the exam trying to come up with exactly the right term. So the definite word here, off the top of my head, I can't remember what word type the word when is, so I've put definite word instead. I'm kind of describing it. It's all right, it will do the job, and I'll progress with my essay without getting too hung up on things. Now I'm going to move into my on closer inspection. So I've used ostensibly up here to look at that surface level, and the on closer inspection, as I said, helps us to get under the skin of the poem. So on closer inspection, the pronoun we may suggest that the speaker still believes that he is linked to his lover. Okay, because he's using the pronoun we, it does suggest a connection, doesn't it? You don't use that word if you're separated from somebody. So we do have that sense of connection, even if it's not quite as good as it could be. So this sense of connection, however weak, is compounded, spelled that wrong, compounded by the use of direct address and rhetorical questions as the speaker tries to reach out to his former lover and to share his feelings with her. Perhaps this is one reason why the speaker seems unable to move on from the relationship. Now I'm going to do a little bit of structure analysis, which is really important to do when we're writing about poetry, if you can do that. A detail which is expressed in the careful structuring of the poem. So what we have in this poem is circular structure. So the poem starts with "When we two parted in silence and tears" and ends with that same line, "in silence and tears." And we also have something that's called chiasmus. Now, I know I've just said don't get too hung up on using, fancy terms or worrying about getting them, exactly right under the time pressure of the exam. But chiasmus, when you're writing about this particular poem, is a really interesting technique to look at. Basically, chiasmus is a particular pattern. And the pattern is basically A-B-B-A or A-B-C-B-A. So I'll type that out on the screen because it might help you to see that a little bit better. And you can see that we've got the first bit of the pattern set out, A-B-C, and then we've got it reversed or mirrored or flipped round to C-B-A. And we have that in the rhyming words of the poem. So at the start of the poem, we have the word tears that rhymes with years. And then at the end of the poem, we have the word years that rhymes with tears. So you can see that what Byron's done is really beautifully flipped the pattern round in the poem. So I really like that detail in this particular poem. So I'm just going to explain that a little bit here. So the poem starts with tears and years and concludes with years and tears. And the reason why this circular structure in this chiasmus is really interesting in this poem is because it creates a kind of cycle, a circle in which the poet is stuck and he's unable to move on from that. So this indicates a cycle of unhappy love which the speaker is unable to break. Okay, so I've analysed some language, I've analysed the structure of the poem, I've looked at the surface level of the poem, and I've dug deeper into the text as well. So now I need to link it to Winter Swans. Now there's different ways that you can do this, and it's totally up to you which one you use. Personally, I like to write about both poems in the same paragraph and make some links between them. Other people like to have them in separate paragraphs, and that is absolutely fine, it's up to you. So I'm going to put similarly to connect the poem. So similarly, in Winter Swans, the speaker finds himself caught up in difficult circumstances, and the couple seem to struggle to help their relationship to progress. And then I'm going to embed my quotation as they walk around the lake. The waterlogged earth slows their progress. So if you wanted to write about these in separate paragraphs, just do that. Or if you want to have them in the same paragraph but keep them together, totally up to you. Then once I've got my quotation in there, I go on to do exactly what I've done for Byron and peel back the layers of the language and the structure of Winter Swans. After that, I would move on to my second comparative idea, and if I have time, on to my third comparative idea as well. Finally, it's time to write our conclusion. So my conclusions generally have 2 sentences. I like to keep them quite simple. The function of the conclusion is to provide an answer to the question and also to look at the key concepts, so those big ideas that the writers are communicating. I like to start my conclusions with the word ultimately. You will know that if you've watched my other videos. So I'm going to say here, ultimately, both poets reveal that romantic relationships can be challenging and suffer when placed under pressure, whether that be from society's expectations about the behaviour of unmarried couples or difficulties in communication. And then I'm going to look at what the poets are trying to communicate. So it is clear that despite writing in different time periods, both poets are communicating the idea that love is central to an individual's well-being and that without it, life can become diminished. It's quite a sad note to end on. Obviously, in Winter Swans, the couple managed to find reconciliation, and that's the right choice for them in that particular instance. Byron Speaker doesn't manage to find that. But we know from Byron's biography that he went on, if the poem was autobiographical, and we know that Byron didn't suffer in silence for too long. Okay, thank you very much for watching. There's lots of resources on my website, on my blog, so if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you go to amysmithliterature.wordpress.com so that you can find those resources to help with your revision as well.